Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Clausewitz said that politics and diplomacy were war by other means. Churchill put it more colorfully when he said that diplomacy is the art of telling people to go to hell in such a way that they ask for directions. The impeachment hearings pulled back the cover on the work, the integrity, and the quality of America's diplomats. Perhaps it's their uneffacing, sometimes quiet professionalism that seemingly makes them targets of the more malevolent forces in our government. This was certainly true with respect to attacks on the State Department during the dark days of McCarthyism, as it's equally true during the dark days of Trump. Whatever the reason, perhaps there's no better time to look at these talented and smart men and women than now in the midst of the Ukraine scandal. We're going to talk about that today with my guest, Paul Richter. Paul Richter covered the State Department and foreign policy for the Los Angeles Times for many years. He previously covered the Pentagon, the White House, and New York's financial industry. It is my pleasure to welcome Paul Richter here to talk about the ambassadors, America's diplomats on the front lines. Paul, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to do it.
Well, it's great to have you here. Why is it that the State Department in general, the diplomacy in a sense, often comes in for such criticism, particularly in difficult international times?
Well, they've got two problems. One is the public doesn't see them much. They're a small group, really, and their job is to say things softly, not to reveal too much, and they don't really stand out. The generals, the spy chiefs, the special forces operators, they're flashier and they get more attention. The other problem is that the Foreign Service is a group of experts who are paid to have an independent judgment on foreign affairs, and often presidents and also members of Congress think that those opinions kind of get in their way because presidents and members of Congress want to make a mark on world affairs and do ambitious things.
Talk a little bit about the Foreign Service and the difference, and it's one of the things that's come out in the course of the hearings, the difference between those that are in the professional Foreign Service, ambassadors that have served for a long time in multiple countries, and people like Gordon Sondland who come in as ambassadors because it's a kind of pay-to-play system in part.
Right. Well, the custom in recent decades has been that about one-third of the ambassadors are political appointees and two-thirds are career diplomats. The political appointees are often donors. They're people who've helped out presidents by raising money, by bundling money during campaigns, and they don't have the same background, obviously, that the career diplomats do. So it's quite a divide. Now, some of these political appointees are very talented people who have a lot of skills and do a really good job. But many others of them are not well equipped and don't have the background and don't even understand much about the countries that are assigned to.
Right. And part of what we see is that it's often the skilled professional diplomats, the career Foreign Service people, that get the most difficult postings, that have the countries where there are real problems.
That's right. If you're an ambassador donor, you want to go to the nice places. You want to go to Western Europe, the West Indies. There are places that have beautiful embassies. You want to go there, and you don't want to go to the hot spots. But the ambassadors that I write about in my book are the people who go to the real hellholes, who take on the toughest jobs in the battle zones.
Has there been a significant change, do you think, in the way professional diplomats are looked at today versus the way they were viewed in the period immediately after World War II, in the post-war period when there was a higher respect and appreciation for those diplomats?
Well, you remember right after World War II was a low point for the diplomatic corps because there was the McCarthy era where there were suspicions by conservative members of Congress and others that there were too many communists and fellow travelers in the State Department. So that was a dark period. But then later, I think the reputation of the State Department recovered somewhat, And for most of the Cold War, I think it was people looked more favorably on them.
When did it get caught up in this whole idea of quote unquote the deep state?
Well, that's a fairly the term is new. You know, that was originally applied to countries like Pakistan and Egypt, where there's military leadership really run the show. But there has been suspicions by presidents for a very long time, including Democratic presidents, that the diplomatic corps had their own priorities and their own view of the world. And the presidents feared that the career diplomats didn't really fully share their agenda in foreign relations.
One of the things that you talk about in your book, The Ambassadors, is a number of people that really have done remarkable work. People like Ryan Crocker, for example.
Well, Ryan Crocker was called America's Lawrence of Arabia by George W. Bush because Crocker had kind of been everywhere and done everything. He was ambassador to 6 countries, and they were all tough places. You know, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Kuwait. He really liked going to the battle zones. He felt he was good at that from the beginning of his career. He was in Beirut in 1983 when the U.S. embassy was bombed, and Crocker had to spend a couple of days pulling bodies of Lebanese and Americans out of the wreckage. And it was a crisis, but Crocker realized then that he was cool in that kind of situation, that he had the kind of skill to handle situations like that, and that drew him back to these tough spots again and again.
To what extent is our view of diplomats and diplomacy shaped by popular culture, do you think? By the way diplomats have been portrayed in literature and movies, etc.?
I think it is shaped to that way to a great extent because they're usually seen as people who sip cocktails in evening dress in embassy parties. And part of that image is because average Americans don't have much contact with the ambassadors, and they don't really know any differently. They don't hear about what these people are doing behind the scenes. And as I said, ambassadors are not encouraged to be candid and splashy. There are a few who are, but for the most part, they tend to be really muted. So the public doesn't know much about them. You know, there was a movie made about one of the people I wrote about, Chris Stevens, and in the movie, Stevens was portrayed as kind of a soft guy who spouted diplomatic cliches and had to be rescued in Benghazi, Libya, by these brawny security guys who were there and tried to fight off this terrorist attack at the American mission in Benghazi.
And in fact, that wasn't who Chris Stevens was at all.
No, I mean, he was a guy who volunteered to sneak into Libya on a cargo ship while Libya was being bombed by NATO. And he stayed through the Libyan civil war in Benghazi. One night he had to get out of his bedroom because they were afraid that there were Scud missiles about to rain down on his hotel. He had to hang out and try to meet all the local militant leaders. I mean, he really put up with a lot of danger, and he went into Benghazi on the trip that, led to the end of his life because he thought he really needed to be out there dealing with people in that tough part of the country.
To what extent has the work of diplomats in the field and some of these people we've been talking about, to what extent has that been shaped at different times depending on who the Secretary of State was?
Well, the Secretary of State and the President and their agenda really has a lot to do with the role of the Foreign Service generally. When George Bush, after 9/11, decided that the U.S. needed to really become more aggressive in the Middle East, the Foreign Service had to go along with the military and the intelligence community out into these countries in the Middle East and South Asia to do part of the job. So thousands of diplomats were sent to Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they were really a lot of them were unprepared for this because they signed up for diplomatic service at a time when it wasn't expected that diplomats would have to serve under fire.
Talk a little bit about the relationship that has existed historically between diplomats and the Pentagon.
Well, there's been for long periods of time they've gotten along well, but in recent years, after 9/11, there's been some jockeying for influence because in the era that I wrote about, the military was used much more heavily in these countries, and generals like General David Petraeus and General John Allen had a lot more people under their command and a lot of influence because these were wartime situations. So naturally, the military had a much bigger role, and sometimes there's kind of a cultural clash between the military and the diplomats because they speak a different language. The military guys speak in their own code, and they use their own abbreviations, and the diplomats, they don't have that language at all. So there's kind of a culture clash there. One of my diplomats, Robert Ford, told me that sometimes he understood the Iraqis better than he understood the American military. So there is that conflict. But at the same time, they've often gotten along well. I mean, General Petraeus and Ryan Crocker got along harmoniously. Crocker got along really well with John Allen in Afghanistan, too. So though there are often tensions, there's often been good relations.
To what extent do you think that the exposure, and some of this is speculation, the exposure that these professionals are getting now, today, literally today, what do you think that impact will be?
Well, I mean, I think there's basically a battle going on for the reputation of the diplomat, because the testimony in recent days by people like Bill Taylor and George Kent and today this guy David Holmes has really caused some people to view them as heroes, people who've come out to stand up for what they believed in about America's interests. But on the other hand, at the same time, these people are also being denounced elsewhere in the media, and so it's a pitched battle, and we'll see what happens.
It does harken back to the McCarthy era when they were criticized, I think, by McCarthy himself as being pointy-headed elitists.
Right, and Richard Nixon was part of that, and he was deeply suspicious of the diplomatic corps. And even after he left office, he testified to a grand jury in 1975 that the State Department folks were a bunch of eunuchs who hadn't had a new idea in 25 years.
Talk a little bit about what you see the attitude being inside the State Department now as you talk to all of these ambassadors, these professional and career people. How do they feel about the work that they do?
These people are drawn to it for a couple of reasons. One is they really find it fun. They really find the subject interesting. They think they can have a big impact. Many of them also believe that they can do something for the country as well. A lot of them come from families that have been sending people into public service for generations. Many of them into the military as well as the diplomatic service and sometimes the intelligence services as well. So that's their motivation. Now, they're worried about the current administration because President Trump has a more wary attitude, to say the least, about career diplomats, and the Foreign Service has been kind of scaled back and put into less important jobs in the last couple of years. And now that these diplomats have come out and testified publicly, it may be that the Trump administration is going to be even more suspicious of them, and that the Foreign Service's role will be reduced further. So I think there's a lot of apprehension about what comes next. You know, a lot of these people, to give you an example, David Holmes, who is testifying today, you know, he put a lot of effort into his career as a diplomat. He studied international relations at Pomona College. Then he went to the Woodrow Wilson School, a graduate school, and he's been in there for years. So he doesn't want to, you know, doesn't want to shift careers at this point in his life. He and a lot of these other Foreign Service people, experienced people, love this career and want to hang with it, but they're worried about what comes next.
Is there a recruitment problem today?
Well, it's interesting. The number of young people who take the Foreign Service exam is about 8,000 a year now, which is down from a peak of, I think, 20,000 in 2010. So there's been a real slackening. But at the same time, a lot of young people see this as an exciting, interesting kind of work. And I have friends who teach courses at international relations graduate schools, and they say there's still a lot of talented young people who want to get into this kind of work.
It does seem like the political divide in this country and nationalist fervor that exists in certain corners has played a role in this as well, in terms of making us look more inward as opposed to outward at the rest of the world.
Yes. Well, we're at a moment now after these long wars in the greater Middle East where so many Americans think that we've kind of been overextended and that we need to, that these wars have been a loss without a lot of, proven benefits. And so they want to pull back on that. And I think as a result of that, there probably is going to be a retrenchment and less adventurousness overseas. But I think that can go too far, because if we ignore some of these problems overseas, their effects can come and hit us. I mean, emigration from places like Syria and Afghanistan has really destabilized Europe, which is our strongest ally in the world. And so we can't entirely ignore all these things that are going on.
The irony is that if we're concerned about these long wars and still having to exist and deal with the rest of the world, it is an argument for greater diplomacy and greater skill on the part of America's Foreign Service.
I think that's absolutely correct. You know, even if we can wind down all these wars, we're still going to deal with a big and growing problem of unstable states all over the world. Africa, Central Asia, but also in Latin America. You know, we have these countries, weak countries in Central America now that are in deep trouble and that are sending a lot of immigrants toward us. So we need to help stabilize them, or their problems will become our problems.
Is there any kind of a nexus that you found between our Foreign Service and American diplomats and diplomats from other countries, and how they're able to work together and the quality of the people in those other foreign services?
Well, the Europeans in general have high quality diplomats. They don't, for the most part, allow any kind of amateur political donors to get important ambassadorships. They see that as a real peculiarity of the American system. They wouldn't think of sending somebody who was not a career diplomat to be the ambassador in Washington, for example. For the most part, though, the Brits, the French, the Germans, they have highly trained diplomats who get along well with our diplomatic services, and they generally share the same view of the world. So these are good relationships, and I talk about that some in my book.
Mm-hmm. And what about China? What about their diplomatic efforts? What do you see there?
Well, they also take it very seriously. It's also a professional diplomatic corps. I would say their diplomacy is closely tied to their economic aims and military aims, perhaps especially the economic aims. So I think they're closer. They may be even more intertwined with the Chinese leadership's political goals overseas, even than our people are.
Is there a new generation emerging in the diplomatic corps?
Well, there's been a gradual shift. The State Department has tried to make the Foreign Service more diverse over the years. You may know that in the old days, the line was that the Foreign Service was male, pale, and Yale,
Right.
because most of their people were kind of from the East Coast establishment. And so beginning in the 70s, there's been an effort to bring in a more diverse group, but that's been hard to do, and they've struggled. It turns out that the diplomatic corps had more African American members a few years ago than it does today. It's been consistently difficult to bring in African Americans and Hispanics, and they're trying it. They're doing outreach around the country to kind of make it more diverse, but it's still a struggle.
Why has it been so difficult?
I'm not really entirely sure of that. There's something about probably competing lines of work that are probably drawing away talented candidates to other fields. That would be my guess. I'm not sure how that works.
And certainly, if what we've seen recently is any indication, there seems to be more certainly women coming into the diplomatic corps.
I think there are. I think there's a good draw on talented women. That's been they've had more success bringing in women than they have minority candidates, but it's still not as many as they'd like. Now, Ann Patterson, who I write about in my book, she had a series of really responsible jobs. They loved her, and they just kept giving her. They moved her from one position to the next, and she took on some really tough ones. At one point, she was running the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, which is this huge bureau that tries to deal with these insoluble problems of drugs and crime internationally. And they're always getting in trouble with Congress because they dispense a lot of money that has, that's not, can't be carefully monitored in its spending in foreign countries. It's really tough, and Ann Patterson was willing to take it on.
And talk a bit about the relationship that has existed between the intelligence community and the diplomatic corps.
Well, they work closely together, and they have sometimes overlapping functions. When Ryan Crocker was in Pakistan, and when he was in Afghanistan, the intelligence services were gathering information like he was. They were involved in the counter-terror operations, which he was to a lesser extent, but he also, that was a big part of his brief. Sometimes, the CIA and the intelligence agencies have been described as diplomats with teeth because they do some of the same things. You may remember that after 9/11, the first Americans to go into Afghanistan to try to knock over the Taliban government were CIA operatives, and they were the first people to try to stand up a new government in Afghanistan after the Taliban fell.
Is morale terrible at the State Department these days?
Well, of course, Secretary Pompeo is insisting it's not, but from everything that I gather from talking to to diplomats who are on the job. People are very nervous, very worried, and I would say that a lot of people, because they love this kind of work and have put a lot of effort into their careers, they're just hoping that there'll be a change, that if President Trump is reelected, he'll come to have a different attitude about diplomacy and appreciate it more, or there'll be a new president who tries to restore the State Department to its former glory. But you've probably seen predictions that it may take a generation for the Foreign Service to be restored to what it was earlier.
Paul Richter, his book is The Ambassadors, America's Diplomats on the Front Lines. Paul, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.